What would you call a woman who strangled her own newborn baby, framed her rival for the crime, and then watched with a smile as enemies were boiled alive for her entertainment? What would you call a ruler who fed generals to starving tigers, forced scholars into silence, and built a spy network so vast that even whispers inside the palace could mean death? History calls her Wu Zetian, China's one and only female emperor. For centuries, her name has been spoken in the same breath as the most infamous tyrants of Rome and beyond. But Wu's reign was darker, more twisted, and far more fascinating. This is not just a story of cruelty. It is the tale of a woman who clawed her way from a forgotten concubine to the dragon throne itself, and ruled with terror, brilliance, and paranoia unlike the world had ever seen. 7th century China was a world of power, poetry, and brutal politics. The Tang Dynasty, celebrated as one of the golden ages of Chinese civilization, was also a battlefield of intrigue, betrayal, and silent wars fought behind the palace gates. In this era, women were meant to remain in the shadows, wives, concubines, or nuns locked away from power. Yet, from within this system, a single woman emerged who not only broke the rules, but shattered them entirely. Her name was Wu Zetian. She began her life in the imperial palace as a mere concubine, one among hundreds. By tradition, when her emperor died, she should have been banished to a convent, left to shave her head and live in obscurity. But Wu was not like the others. She refused to fade into silence. Instead, she seized her chance, seducing the new emperor, her late master's son, and weaving a plot that would leave blood on her own hands and terror in the hearts of rivals. The palace, with its jade corridors and perfumed halls, became her hunting ground. Rivals vanished, accusations appeared out of thin air, and before long, Wu Zetian rose from obscurity to become Empress. But this was only the beginning. What followed was a reign of calculated brutality, ingenious governance, and paranoia so intense it reshaped the empire itself. From inventing tortures that made hardened generals weep, to turning the empire into a nest of spies where no one trusted even their own family, Wu Zetian ruled through fear. Yet, paradoxically, she also strengthened China, expanding its borders, reforming its bureaucracy, and promoting talent regardless of birth. Her story is not a simple one of villainy. It is a twisted paradox. The most terrifying ruler in Chinese history, and yet one of its most effective. And so, as we step into her world, prepare to walk through corridors echoing with screams, to witness power taken to its darkest extremes, and to meet the woman who turned an empire into her personal stage of horror and glory. The story of Wu Zetian's rise to power does not begin with blood. It begins with silence. When Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty died in 649 AD, the rules of the court were clear. His concubines, no matter how beautiful or talented, were to be sent away to Buddhist convents. Their hair shaved, their silks stripped, their lives erased. Wu, still in her early 20s, was among those destined to vanish behind temple walls, never to touch the luxuries of the palace again. But Wu was not a woman who accepted destiny. As other concubines resigned themselves to obscurity, Wu began, plotting her return. She knew something the others didn't. The new emperor, Gaozong, son of Taizong, had once noticed her. She remembered his glances, his lingering looks. In that spark of memory, Wu saw an opportunity. The palace was a maze of rules, rituals, and rivalries. To slip back into it required more than beauty. It demanded courage and cunning. Wu cut her hair in mourning, entered the convent like the rest, and waited. And when the time was right, she re-emerged. Some say it was fate. Others say it was her ambition. Gaozong, visiting the temple, saw her again, and this time he did not resist. Wu returned to the palace not as a forgotten widow of a dead emperor, but as the favorite of the living one. It was an audacious move, a scandal that whispered through the marble corridors. But scandal alone could not secure power. At the heart of the palace stood two formidable obstacles: Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, and consort Xiao, his beloved mistress. Both women had deep influence, strong families, and the emperor's affection. If Wu wished to rule, they had to fall. Here lies one of the darkest turning points in her story. Wu bore Gaozong a daughter, an innocent infant whose life should have been a symbol of her security. Instead, Wu made a choice so chilling that it echoes across history. She strangled her own child, and then, with tears flowing down her face, she accused Empress Wang of murder. Imagine the scene: the emperor rushing into Wu's chambers, the lifeless infant cradled in her arms, the air thick with grief and rage. Wu's performance was flawless. She was the grieving mother, the betrayed lover, the victim of palace cruelty. Gaozong's suspicion turned to fury. His eyes, once filled with love for Empress Wang, now burned with hatred. The empress, bewildered, denied everything, but in the court of whispers and shadows, her protests meant nothing. Wu had played her part perfectly. But she was not finished. Over the next months, she fed Gaozong lies, staged evidence, and poisoned his mind against both Empress Wang and consort Xiao. She painted them as traitors, plotting behind his back. Step by step, rumor by rumor, she eroded their standing until Gaozong had no choice but to act. The fall was brutal. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were arrested, stripped of their titles, and delivered into Wu's hands. What happened next was less justice than vengeance. Historical records tell us Wu oversaw their punishments personally, severing their limbs, drowning them in vats of wine, and ensuring their deaths were not quick but agonizing. As they died, one of them cursed Wu, vowing to return as a cat to haunt her. From that day forward, Wu banned cats from the palace, proof that even monsters carry fears. By 655 AD, Wu had destroyed her rivals. The throne beside Gaozong was hers. She was now Empress Wu, not the highest point of her ambition, but merely the first step. The palace trembled. Ministers whispered that a storm had arrived, that the dragon throne itself had been tainted with blood. But Wu did not care. She had tasted power, and she knew this was only the beginning. Because for Wu Zetian, becoming empress was not the end of her climb. It was the opening act of a reign that would turn the Tang Dynasty into her personal theater of fear. Wu Zetian had seized the title of empress, but titles alone did not guarantee survival. The Tang Dynasty court was a nest of vipers, nobles, ministers, and generals, all waiting for the moment she might stumble. To remain on the throne, Wu needed more than influence. She needed fear. From the very beginning, her reign was shadowed with whispers. Court officials muttered that she had stolen her position with blood, that Gaozong had been blinded by lust, that the empire had been cursed the moment she stepped into power. Wu heard every whisper, and she remembered. The court became her theater of vengeance. Her first move was swift and merciless. Empress Wang and consort Xiao, the two women who had once stood in her way, were not allowed the luxury of forgotten imprisonment. Wu wanted them to suffer, publicly, painfully, undeniably. According to records, she ordered their hands and feet, severed before they were thrown into vats of wine, left to drown in their own blood. Whether the details are exaggerated or not, the message was unmistakable. Anyone who opposed Wu Zetian would meet a fate worse than death. The palace trembled. What had once been a place of poetry, banquets, and delicate politics now became a stage for horror. Ministers and nobles learned quickly that the new empress was not merely ambitious, she was ruthless. Yet Wu was careful. She understood that brutality without strategy collapses into chaos. Every act of violence had purpose. Each execution sent ripples through the empire. When she destroyed Empress Wang, she eliminated not only a rival but also the powerful family supporting her. When she crushed consort Zhao, she silenced an entire faction of the court. But fear, once planted, must be watered. Wu began introducing punishments designed not only to kill but to terrify. She oversaw executions personally, standing with calm detachment as blood stained the marble floors. Prisoners were mutilated, paraded through the streets, or forced into humiliating deaths that lingered in the minds of all who witnessed them. And yet, Wu's genius lay not just in cruelty, but in performance. She understood the psychology of power. An execution was not merely a punishment, it was a message, a story told to everyone watching. In the capital, tales of her punishment spread like wildfire, whispered in markets, carried to distant provinces. Even those who never set foot in the palace began to fear her shadow. The chilling effect was immediate. Court officials stopped speaking freely, lowering their voices even in their own homes. Servants hesitated to gossip. Generals saluted with trembling hands. Wu Zetian had achieved what she wanted: silence. But silence did not mean peace. Her husband, Emperor Gaozong, was still officially the ruler of China. Yet illness often left him weak, and Wu stepped forward to govern in his place. She issued edicts, judged cases, and made decisions that once belonged only to the emperor. Ministers who objected quickly found themselves accused of treason, or worse. It was in these years that Wu perfected the art of using the law as a weapon. She manipulated courts, rewrote charges, and turned justice into an instrument of fear. A single accusation, real or fabricated, could end a career or a life. Still, beneath the surface, resistance simmered. The old aristocratic families of the Tang Dynasty resented her rise. Scholars mocked her in coded poems, hiding insults in metaphors. Generals whispered that a woman on the throne was a disgrace. Wu heard it all, and she prepared. Her reign as Empress was only the foundation. Soon she would move beyond the role of consort and seize the dragon throne for herself. But before she could, she needed to crush dissent entirely. The killings of Wang and Xiao were only the first drops of blood. What came next would be a flood. Because Wu Zetian had discovered something intoxicating. Fear was not just a shield, it was power, and she would wield it until every rival bowed or bled. Fear had given Wu Zetian control, but control was fragile. The Tang court was filled with men who had lived their entire lives believing women were ornaments, not rulers. Fear alone would make them quiet. It would not make them obedient. For obedience, Wu needed something darker. She needed terror. Wu understood something few rulers before her had grasped. The imagination of pain could be as powerful as the pain itself. And so, she began to craft punishments so inventive, so grotesque, that even the mention of them froze her enemies in silence. Among her most infamous creations was a punishment whispered about in horror: the human swine. Prisoners sentenced to this fate were mutilated, their limbs severed, their ears and noses cut away, their eyes gouged out. Their tongues were torn out to silence their screams. What remained of them was thrown into a sty, forced to wallow in filth until infection or starvation claimed them. Wu used this punishment not on common criminals but on rivals, especially women who had once dared to stand against her. The message was clear. She would not only defeat her enemies, but unmake them, transforming them into something less than human. Then came the cauldrons, massive bronze vessels filled with water, set upon roaring fires. Prisoners were stripped and forced inside as the water slowly boiled. The screams echoed through the palace, mixing with the scent of roasted flesh. Some accounts describe Wu dining nearby, calmly lifting morsels of food to her lips as if the agony before her were no more than background music. Was it true? Perhaps. But whether or not she truly dined by the cauldrons, the story spread. And that was the point. The people believed it, and the fear was real. There were other torments as well. Victims strung upside down until the blood rushed to their heads, bursting vessels in their eyes, sometimes killing them after hours of agony. Others were suspended just high enough that their fingertips grazed the ground, their bodies trembling in futile effort to relieve the pressure. Wu was said to have experimented with variations, noting which methods produced the longest suffering. If these tales sound like nightmares, it is because that was precisely what Wu intended. Every torture was a performance. Every execution a lesson. She turned her palace into a laboratory of fear, her victims into unwilling subjects in a study of pain. But Wu's genius was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. She understood the psychology of power better than any of her contemporaries. Imagine you are a minister in her court. You have heard the stories. You have seen the broken bodies dragged through the streets. You have passed the iron gates that concealed her chambers of agony. Now, when you are called upon to speak in council, how careful would you be with your words? How eager would you be to contradict her? This was Wu's brilliance. Her punishments reached far beyond the victims. They infected the minds of everyone around her. Officials who once schemed openly now weighed every syllable. Generals who once boasted of their victories now bowed with trembling hands. Fear became loyalty. As the years passed, Wu's court grew quieter. Where once debates had raged and poetry had flowed, now silence reigned. Ministers agreed with everything she said. Advisers praised her even when her policies were flawed. No one dared risk dissent. And yet, even as terror choked the empire, Wu was careful to balance it with order. She used her iron grip not only to crush opposition, but also to enforce stability. Criminals who might once have escaped justice were swiftly punished. Corrupt officials learned that her wrath was not reserved solely for rivals. Even allies could be destroyed if they betrayed her trust. To the common people, far from the palace, Wu's reign was paradoxical. They heard whispers of her cruelty, yes, but they also saw roads being repaired, taxes being managed, and the empire's borders secured. For them, Wu's terror was distant thunder. For the court, it was lightning. That struck without warning. Stories of her tortures spread across the empire, exaggerated in retellings, embroidered in whispers. Some claimed she invented devices so strange they defied belief. Iron cages that slowly compressed, ropes soaked in oil and set aflame, elaborate contraptions designed to prolong agony. Whether true or not, the stories were enough. The legend of her cruelty grew larger than life, until fear itself became self-sustaining. She no longer needed to execute as many, because people believed she would. Wu Zetian had transformed punishment into a weapon of statecraft. She had turned terror into policy, and in doing so, she reshaped the very foundations of Tang rule. But cruelty alone could not maintain her empire. To rule absolutely, she needed more than instruments of pain. She needed eyes and ears everywhere. She needed to know every whisper, every plot, every betrayal before it struck. And so, Wu created something far more terrifying than torture chambers. She created a surveillance state. Torture had silenced Wu Zetian's court, but silence could be dangerous. If ministers dared not speak openly, they would conspire in whispers. If generals trembled before her, they might scheme in secret, and Wu could not allow secrets. So she built a machine, one not of gears and iron, but of fear and betrayal, a surveillance state centuries ahead of its time. At the center of this machine was a new breed of enforcer, men handpicked for their ruthlessness. They became known as the cruel officials. They were not bound by law nor restrained by conscience. Wu gave them authority to accuse, arrest, and punish anyone, noble or commoner, suspected of disloyalty. Among them was Lai Junchen, a name that became as dreaded as Wu's own. Lai devised 10 tortures, methods so grotesque they seemed crafted by demons. He crushed fingers in iron clamps, drove bamboo splinters beneath fingernails, forced prisoners to swallow boiling vinegar until their throats dissolved. His masterpiece was the donkey kick, where victims were tied in impossible positions until every joint in their bodies snapped one by one. In Wu's empire, justice was not blind. It was monstrous, and it wore her face. But terror required more than executioners. It required informants. And Wu understood the most dangerous weapon in politics: suspicion. Across the capital, she placed bronze boxes in public squares and temples. Citizens were invited, encouraged, to drop written accusations inside. No evidence required, no name signed. A single slip of paper could destroy a family. Imagine living in such a world. A servant, bitter with his master, could accuse him of treason. A jealous neighbor could denounce a rival. Even within households, fear reigned, children betraying parents, wives turning in husbands. For in Wu's empire, loyalty to the state outweighed loyalty to blood. Every morning, officials opened the boxes and delivered the accusations to the throne. Wu did not dismiss them. She investigated each one, no matter how absurd. And, more often than not, the accused did not return. This system reshaped society. It was no longer generals and ministers who determined fates, but anonymous whispers. Everyone lived under the shadow of suspicion. Families dined in silence, careful of their words even at the table. Officials avoided gatherings, fearing a jest might be twisted into treason. Some nobles wrote farewell letters to their families, each morning before reporting to court, uncertain if they would live to see nightfall. And yet, Wu's paranoia had another layer. She did not trust even her spies. She created multiple networks, each one ordered to watch the others. Informants spied on informants. Cruel officials investigated cruel officials. Lai Junchen himself, feared across the empire, eventually fell victim to his own web. Wu accused him of overreaching power and had him executed, proving that even the hunter could become the prey. The brilliance of Wu's surveillance state was not in the arrests, but in the uncertainty. If you knew she had spies in your household, would you risk disloyalty? If you knew one word could end your life, would you ever speak it? She had weaponized paranoia. The court became a stage where every actor performed obedience. Ministers bowed deeper, spoke softer, agreed faster. No one knew who among them might carry a hidden note, a whispered lie. The empire itself seemed haunted, not by ghosts, but by the endless possibility of betrayal. And yet, as with her tortures, Wu's system achieved more than fear. It achieved control. Rebellions were crushed before they began. Conspiracies collapsed under the weight of mutual suspicion. Even powerful aristocratic families, once untouchable, found themselves vulnerable to a single anonymous accusation. The empire stood in uneasy stillness. For Wu Zetian, it was proof of her genius. She had created a world where loyalty was enforced not by love or honor, but by the constant dread of watching eyes. But fear alone, again, was not enough. Wu sought not just control, but spectacle. She wanted to terrify her enemies in ways no rumor could match. And so she turned to a weapon more primal than spies, more ancient than torture. She unleashed the beasts. If torture struck fear into the court, and spies poisoned trust across the empire, Wu Zetian's next invention was designed to shatter courage itself. She turned execution into theater, and her actors were not men, but beasts. The Tang Palace had always displayed exotic animals, gifts from foreign envoys or symbols of imperial power. But under Wu, these creatures were no longer ornaments. They were weapons. Tigers starved until their ribs pressed against their skin. Packs of feral dogs, trained to bite and tear. Wolves, lean and hungry, taught to hunt men as if they were deer. Bears prodded and enraged until their roars shook the iron bars of their cages. These were not pets. They were executioners. Imagine the scene. A wide stone courtyard, encircled by walls high enough to keep the crowd safe but low enough to see everything. Above, silk banners flutter. Courtiers sip wine, their faces pale but forced into smiles. Foreign ambassadors sit in honored seats, expecting poetry, music, or dance. Instead, the gates creak open and a prisoner is dragged out, naked, trembling, thrown onto the dust. From the opposite gate, the beasts emerge. A tiger paces, snarling. Wolves lunge forward as the chains are loosed. The air fills with growls and screams, the clash of claws and flesh. Wu watches from her dais, her face calm, almost serene, as if she were presiding over a religious ritual. Each animal had its meaning. High-ranking traitors met the tigers. Royal. Beasts for royal crimes. Corrupt officials were given to the wolves. Pack hunters for pack conspirators. Betrayers within her own family were fed to the dogs, whose loyalty had been twisted into savagery. And Wu ensured the deaths were slow. Tigers trained to wound before killing. Bears taught to swipe, not crush. Dogs encouraged to start at the feet, keeping victims alive until the end. The spectacle worked. Ministers returned to court pale and shaken, their robes still carrying the scent of blood. Foreign envoys, horrified, carried tales of Wu's arenas back to their homelands, magnifying her legend. Even hardened generals, men who had faced battlefields, trembled when they heard the growls echoing from the palace cages. With every scream, with every crimson-stained stone, Wu Zetian proved that she was more than a ruler. She was a force of nature, one that devoured her enemies not only with soldiers or laws, but with teeth and claws. But as her beasts tore through flesh, another hunger grew within Wu herself. Fear had secured her rule, but paranoia whispered in her ear, "What if they come for you next?" The spectacle of beasts had cemented Wu Zetian's power, but absolute power rarely brings peace of mind. For Wu, it brought shadows, whispers she could, not silence, threats she could not see. She began to believe enemies lurked everywhere. If a minister bowed too slowly, he was plotting. If a general won too many victories, he was ambitious. If a scholar wrote a poem with metaphors she did not understand, perhaps it was a coded insult. Suspicion became her constant companion. Wu's solution was not subtle. She did not merely execute rivals, she erased them. Entire families, men, women, children, even distant cousins, were slaughtered under her command. She called it root and branch elimination. Cut the tree, burn the stump, leave nothing that might grow again. Noble houses that had stood for centuries vanished in weeks. Ancient lineages, once proud guardians of Tang tradition, were reduced to ashes and forgotten graves. The imperial family itself was not spared. Wu's own stepsons and nephews were accused of treason and executed. One of her sons, forced into suicide, died as she wept crocodile tears at his funeral. Another was exiled, only to be murdered in secret. Bloodlines ended, with her signature. By the late 690s, the Tang court was no longer a gathering of scholars and strategists. It had become a graveyard with living ghosts. Ministers arrived each morning uncertain if they would return home that night. Some wrote farewell letters to their families daily, leaving them hidden beneath pillows. Others developed nervous tics, twitching at the sound of footsteps in the hall, jumping at shadows on the wall. One official reportedly whispered to a friend, "Every sunrise is a gamble. Today I breathe. Tomorrow, who knows?" That whisper was overheard. He was gone by nightfall. Wu's bronze accusation boxes overflowed. Thousands of anonymous denunciations poured in, each one another nail in someone's coffin. False confessions were extracted under torture, then paraded as proof. Truth became irrelevant. Wu's will was the only truth that mattered. Outside the palace, paranoia spread like a plague. Families avoided speaking openly, even in their own homes. Servants betrayed masters to save themselves. Brothers turned on brothers. In villages, neighbors accused each other in desperate attempts to escape suspicion. China had become a nation of informants and victims, all trapped in a cycle of terror. Wu's paranoia was not only political, it was personal. She dreamed of conspiracies in her sleep and woke believing them real. She executed 3 entire sets of advisors during her reign, replacing them with ever more submissive men. Each purge left her more isolated, more suspicious, more certain that betrayal waited just beyond the throne room doors, and yet, amid the blood and terror, she still governed with a strange efficiency. Roads were repaired, borders defended, taxes managed. To the common farmer, Wu was both protector and monster, an empress who ensured stability, but at the cost of drowning the empire in fear. By the end of her purges, the court no longer functioned as a place of debate or strategy. It was theater, with every actor too terrified to forget his lines. They nodded, they praised, they obeyed. And Wu, watching their trembling obedience, should have felt secure. Instead, the whispers only grew louder in her mind. The beasts had devoured her enemies. The spies had silenced her rivals. The purges had erased entire families. But paranoia is a hunger that never dies. And soon, it began to consume Wu Zetian herself. By the time Wu Zetian reached her 70s, she had ruled through terror for decades. But power, no matter how absolute, cannot stop the march of age. Her body weakened. Her mind grew restless and paranoia twisted into something stranger, something divine. Wu began to proclaim that she was no ordinary ruler. She was, she insisted, the living reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha destined to guide humanity. Temples across China were ordered to rewrite their prayers, inserting her name alongside the gods. Monks who resisted were executed for blasphemy. Massive statues were commissioned, not of the Buddha, but of Wu herself in divine form, carved into mountainsides and towering over villages. For her, worship was no longer symbolic. It was survival. Inside her palace, Wu surrounded herself with fortune-tellers, astrologers, and mystics who fed her grandest fantasies. Every comet, every eclipse, every shift of the stars was read as proof of her eternal destiny. Ministers were forced to bow not just to their empress but to their living goddess. To preserve her youth, Wu turned to alchemists who promised immortality. They offered mercury-based elixirs, potions laced with metals, pills that glittered like jewels. She swallowed them greedily, believing each dose carried her closer to eternity. Instead, the poison crept into her veins. Her skin grew gray, her hair thinned, her mind blurred. But to her followers, she declared these were signs of transformation, proof that her mortal body was evolving into divine form. Perhaps the most disturbing of Wu's later years was her obsession with young men. Handsome courtiers were summoned to her chambers, chosen as companions. For months, they lived in luxury as her favorites. Then, suddenly, they vanished. Whispers said Wu ordered their executions at the height of their beauty, convinced that killing them preserved their youth and somehow transferred it to her. Whether myth or truth, the pattern was chilling. The palace had become not just a seat of power, but a shrine to her delusions, and a prison for anyone caught in them. Her decisions grew erratic. She declared wars only to sue for peace days later, having forgotten her reasons. She ordered executions based on dreams she claimed were visions. At times, she raged at mirrors, screaming at her own reflection, believing enemies had invaded her body. Ministers began quietly ignoring her commands, gambling that she would forget them by morning. Some pretended her rituals were divine. Others prayed for her decline. All lived in fear that at any moment her madness would turn their devotion into treason. Wu Zetian had once ruled with the precision of a strategist, wielding terror as her weapon. But now she ruled with chaos. Her divine proclamations alienated even her most loyal allies. Her body faltered, her mind shattered under poison and paranoia. And in 705 AD, her ministers finally acted. The woman who had terrorized an empire for decades was quietly deposed, too frail and delusional to resist. Days later, she was dead, killed not by assassins, not by beasts, but by the very elixirs she believed would make her immortal. The goddess she imagined herself to be crumbled into dust. When Wu Zetian finally died in 705 AD, China exhaled. The court that had lived for decades in whispers dared to breathe freely again. Ministers emerged from the shadows, aristocratic families resurfaced, and poets dared to write without fear of hidden meanings being twisted into crimes. The woman, who had cast herself as goddess, as terror, as empress, was gone. But what remained of her? History has painted Wu Zetian in strokes of blood. She is remembered as the empress who killed her own daughter, fed prisoners to beasts, devised tortures so grotesque they scarred the empire's memory. She is the ruler who turned family against family, who extinguished entire bloodlines, who filled bronze boxes with accusations that led to rivers of executions. To many, she was a monster, a cautionary tale of ambition without limits. Proof that absolute power corrupts absolutely. For centuries, historians, most of them men, condemned her as unnatural, unfeminine, wicked. Her reign was described less as governance and more as an abomination. And yet, Wu Zetian's story is not only one of cruelty, it is also one of competence. For beneath the terror, she was an effective administrator. She expanded China's borders, defended them against invaders, and strengthened the empire's hold over Central Asia. She reformed taxation, ensuring a more balanced system that helped farmers rather than only the nobility. She opened the imperial examination system, allowing men of talent, not just men of birth, to rise in government. In her court, scholars from humble origins found themselves seated beside aristocrats, an unprecedented change in a world dominated by lineage. For the first time, merit had a chance to challenge blood. Even religion bent to her will. By aligning herself with Buddhism, she elevated the faith's status in China, encouraging the construction of temples, the spread of scriptures, and the integration of Buddhist values into governance. So, was Wu Zetian only a tyrant, or was she also a reformer cloaked in terror? Perhaps the truth lies in the paradox. She was both. She was the woman who strangled her baby to frame a rival, and the empress who elevated commoners to positions of influence. She was the goddess who demanded worship, and the administrator who stabilized a vast empire. She was madness and method, cruelty and brilliance, destruction and creation, bound together in a single life. Even her death carried irony. She had sought immortality, swallowing poisons disguised as elixirs, declaring herself divine. Instead, she was undone by her own desperation. Her reign ended quietly, not with a battlefield clash, but with a whimper, yet her legend lived on. Today, Wu Zetian's legacy divides historians. Was she the most brutal ruler in Chinese history, or a woman demonized by patriarchal scholars unwilling to admit that a woman had outshone emperors? Was she a tyrant who drowned her empire in blood, or a visionary who proved that women could wield absolute power? What cannot be denied is her impact. She ruled for 15 years as Empress Regnant, the only woman in China's thousands of years of dynasties to hold that title. She left behind an empire shaped by her hand and a legend that still chills and fascinates. So, who was Wu Zetian, a monster who turned her empire into a torture chamber, a genius who redefined governance and merit, or both, a terrifying reminder that power, when pursued without limit, can elevate and destroy in the same breath? History offers no simple answer. But one truth remains. The name Wu Zetian still echoes, centuries later, as a shadow across China's golden age. And perhaps, as you listen to her story, you too feel that shadow, an uneasy blend of awe and horror, lingering long after the Empress herself turned to dust.